It's time to count down my top 5 Disney World extinct attractions, and amazingly, they're not all from Epcot Center. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me once again here on the Tomorrow Society podcast. I'm your host, Dan Heaton, and today's episode is all about extinct attractions at Walt Disney World. And one of the issues that relates to that's happened recently is Disney's announcement that they're going to be changing the auction scene at the Pirates of the Caribbean. And so many fans have had different reactions to what's coming. People are super angry. You have people that are decrying that it's too sensitive in terms of the culture, people talking about history. And I have specific thoughts on kind of each reaction, and my personal feelings aren't really that important in this case because all of us approach this issue very differently. And I think it relates to our own nostalgia for the parks. And what I mean by that is each one of us comes to Disney World from a different perspective, meaning when we became into the parks, whether it could even be back at Disneyland in the 1950s or Disney World's early days in the 70s and 80s. And you have people that are doing podcasts that are as avid as anyone out there that never visited Disney World before like 2007. So we are all going to approach the parks in a very different way. Personally, my formative years in the Disney parks were in the 1980s and early 1990s. I still think back to that first trip to Epcot Center in 1984 and then the subsequent trips after that as new attractions were added. So I'm always going to have a warm place in my heart for those trips and what we did on those trips. It doesn't mean that the attractions that have come since are any lesser, but I'm going to look at changes that Disney announces from that perspective. And that relates to what I'm doing today. I'm going to count down my top 5 extinct attractions at Walt Disney World. These choices are all personal. They all relate to my experiences and what I look for in a theme park. While I might have a very different view from somebody who started visiting in 1998 or someone who goes back to the very first year of the park. But that's what makes these lists fun, because we are all going to have a different interest in what we love in the parks. I'm excited to hear your list and for you guys to respond to mine. So let's get to it. Let's get to my top 5 extinct attractions at Walt Disney World. Okay, so before I begin talking about my list, I want to explain the parameters of how I came up with this list. And these are not hard and fast defined rules, because you may be listening and think, that doesn't totally relate to what he said earlier, but this gives you an idea of the framework for coming up with this list. One, like I mentioned earlier, these choices were part of my formative experience in becoming such an avid Disney fan. That doesn't mean they all opened in 1982. There is some variety there. But when I visited during the 80s and 90s, these were some of my favorite attractions and ones that have really stuck with me over the years. Kind of the second point is I still think about these attractions regularly and have my own memories that go beyond online videos. I also wanted to point out that this does not mean if I make this choice that I don't like the current attraction in the space. That may be the case in several of them, but not with all. Like I really like Soarin' and I really like Test Track. But there were earlier attractions in those spaces that are exciting. So it's not an indictment of a move that Disney made in most cases. It's more just what are the attractions that I loved from the past. And a final thing is if Disney somehow found a way to recreate these attractions physically or virtually, what would drive me to drop everything and go out of my way to fly to Florida to see them? Now, if Disney decided they wanted to do this for Mission to Mars, I don't know if I'd be as thrilled. I would love it. I'd say this is the most amazing thing ever. But I may not be the same as if Disney said, we're bringing back the original Journey into Imagination. Or if Disney said, we're going to bring back 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I know these things won't happen. But my point is that with these picks, these are rides where I think I'd be as excited to ride them now, at least at first, as I would have back then. So that sets the framework for this list. These are attractions that, and they might not be the most high-tech attractions, they might not even be the best from their time periods, but they've stuck the most with me. So let's get to the list. Number 5, World of Motion. This is an opening day attraction from Epcot Center that I know a lot of you are familiar with, even people that never rode it, because Test Track is so popular. If you've ridden Test Track, especially over the years for a while, you might have thought, well, what came before this? And that would be World of Motion, which to me is really the epitome of what Disney was doing in the 70s and 80s in terms of their Omnimover attractions. World of Motion was 15 minutes long. I mean, just think about that. Think about Little Mermaid right now. Think about the current Journey to Imagination. Could you imagine riding one of those for 15 minutes? What would Little Mermaid be like if it was 15 minutes? Might not be great. But the point is, this was an ambitious attraction that did a lot more than just dropped you into something for a few minutes. Like, look at Navia River Journey right now. It has amazing effects, but it's short. I'm not saying the case that attractions should always be longer, but that was part of what made World of Motion so good. It was expansive. You had scenes with just huge amounts of audio animatronics. In fact, the entire attraction had so many animatronics. It was basically the equivalent of a Pirates of the Caribbean type ride. And I'm talking about Pirates at Disneyland. The structure looked similar to what's with Test Track, but was more in the 80s style, shaped like a giant wheel. You boarded Omnimovers. And what I really loved about it was even the introduction. You would go inside. At the time, in the early days, there was actually a line for this, which went away as you went along. But you would step inside and then board on the moving walkway onto the Omnimover, which would then go up a ramp. And the vehicle would then go back outside, make a loop, and go back in. And what was so cool about that little outside move was you got a really good photo view of Spaceship Earth and Universe of Energy. And I have, as a kid, you didn't take as many pictures back then, but I have several really cool pictures of Spaceship Earth. I think I took it every single time I did it. Another thing about World of Motion is it did not take itself too seriously. It was looking through the history of transportation, but you had Gary Owen's narration where basically almost everything he said it in kind of a blustery way, was undercut by what was shown on in the scenes. So he would say something like, nothing stands in the way of progress on the open road, while we saw a ram blocking a stagecoach, or a cop hiding behind a billboard when he's talking about the wonders of driving a car. There was something just so novel, and it definitely had a more old school Disney feel, even different than something like Horizons or Spaceship Earth. This one, even more, felt like kind of the old school Disney animatronics extravaganza. We had a really cool song, It's Fun to Be Free, by Exitensio and Buddy Baker. That really set the whimsical feel of the whole attraction. And another thing I want to mention about this attraction is you had the speed rooms at the end, which will come up again later, which was kind of an early way to make you feel like you were moving, a simulator attraction. But what I loved about it was its simplicity. Basically, you're going in on the Omnimover vehicles, the slow-moving vehicle. You have the screens kind of wrapped around you, and it makes you feel like you're skiing or you're going on a plane or everything else. Or, sometimes they even would have like the Tron scenes. And it was simple, but all it took was some wind and a huge screen. It amazed me what they could do at that time. And some of the things we're doing right now, not that much better than that. One other thing is when you finally actually exited the attraction, there was the Trans Center, which did have cars you could look at and some of the similar things to what they have now at Test Track. But it also had little shows, and it felt like a place that you could explore for a really long time. It was well done. And it fit with that early approach in Epcot Center where you had the ride as the centerpiece, but then other elements in the building that were almost equally good or more interesting and fun than the ride itself. And while it probably would have needed some upgrades to animatronics and to some of the effects, I think it could have hung out for a long time. Now, with that said, what Disney did with Test Track for GM, I'm impressed by. I really like the first Test Track and kind of its tongue-in-cheek again narration from John Michael Higgins, who was the announcer. And the new version's pretty cool. It does seem futuristic. I don't have a problem with Test Track at all. I just wish there was a way we could also have had World of Motion. Number 4, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. So Mr. Toad is still part of Disneyland's Fantasyland, but to me, the real version is the Disney World version. And it's funny to say that because it came after. It's much later. It's not the original version, but it's the one that I rode so much as a kid. It was an opening day attraction, but we rode it in the 80s and early 90s. We rode this so much because it never had a huge line. It had 2 tracks, which meant its capacity was pretty high for this type of Fantasyland dark ride. And the tracks did not give you the same experience, which, mind blown to a kid at that point. So you would go some scenes, you would be in a different place if you were on one track or the other, and then both of them had their entirely new rooms to themselves. And this seems like the attraction that's hardest to explain to somebody who never visited. The ride videos, the few that there are, do not do it justice. And if you haven't been to Disneyland, it's even tougher to explain because it had kind of this zany madcap feel to it. And it didn't really matter if you knew the source material. I don't think I even had seen the Mr. Toad movie or the Wind in the Willows portion of one of the package films until recently. At least I had no memory of it. But it was still so much fun, and it didn't take itself seriously. You had characters drinking beer. You ended up in hell. You had a situation where it seemed like there was a train that was about to hit you. Mr. Toad is the epitome of kind of the weird, odd dark rides that Disney did in its earlier days. Now you still have some of those dark rides in Florida with Peter Pan mainly, but in a lot more in California. Mr. Toad was so much fun, and the Florida version being so large and just having more even than the current California version, which I'm glad that still exists. I can't wait to take my kids on that when I get them out there. But the Florida version for our family and just in general is still one of my favorites. Number 3, the original Journey into Imagination. Now, I have to be clear, I am not talking about Journey into Your Imagination, which was the first upgrade in 1999, which brought in Eric Idle, who was playing Dr. Channing from the Honey, I Shrunk the Audience show, and failed spectacularly. The new version's a little bit better, but still pales in comparison to the original. It's the original attraction, first of all, was 11 minutes. Now our attraction's more like 5 or 6. And that makes a big difference because it allows them to tell a larger story. You don't feel rushed through scenes. It seems to have room to breathe and be more ambitious. And you started out with this brilliant scene where you basically moved alongside Dreamfinder and Figment, and Dreamfinder essentially just explained everything you were going to see. There's a song by the Sherman Brothers, One Little Spark was playing, and they still do play that in the current attraction, and that is the best part for me. But it still doesn't seem to fit as well as it did in that original attraction. Right away, you're introduced to Dreamfinder, he introduces Figment, and then once you clear that section, you go through all these different areas on arts, literature, science. It's one of the odder rides that Disney has ever done, especially because in Epcot Center in the 1980s, there was really an edict that they weren't going to bring in Disney characters. They weren't going to have Mickey. They were going to take things pretty seriously. And I know I mentioned World of Motion was funny, but in general, they did take the mission of optimism about the future and everything super seriously when they made this. So the fact that they also allowed Tony Baxter and Steve Kirk to put together this odd, silly attraction with Dreamfinder or Figment is amazing to me. It opened a little later. It opened in March of that year, and it just felt so imaginative, to use the most obvious phrase, and it didn't feel like anything you'd ever ridden before. I think I appreciated it more as an adult. The last time I went, which I was there in May 98, and I was able to catch it pretty soon before it closed in October. I appreciated it more then than I ever had, because as an adult, you realize it's amazing what Imagineering can do. And I also want to mention the ImageWorks upstairs, which was an amazing playground for kids in the 80s and 90s. You had the Rainbow Corridor. You had so many interactive games. I still have a clear memory, I think probably because my dad videotaped it with a very old video camera, of my brother and I doing the Western scene in Dreamfinder's School of Drama, using the very early blue screen technology that was there at the time. And we spent a lot of time in the ImageWorks. And I know they still have what's sometimes called the ImageWorks or the Kodak What If labs. And those are okay. That's a fun way. My kids had fun in that, though a lot of things don't work very well. But compared to what was upstairs, one, you miss out on that amazing view, which now people get through the DVC lounge that I've not been in yet. In the downstairs part, it's not as expansive, and it doesn't seem to flow as well in the whole place. Because you think about what that pavilion had originally. We started with Magic Journeys, which eventually became Captain EO. You had the whole upstairs ImageWorks, and you had a long ride too. And you look at what's there now with the short films and the short ride and a lounge and everything, and you think, man, what happened? There's got to be something that can be done there. And I know we've heard that there's been rumors about Inside Out, but I feel like those probably aren't going to happen because the movie's a few years old. And I know that things can come in much later. I mean, look at what probably is coming with Ratatouille, or, Little Mermaid was much afterwards. Personally, I don't know. I loved Inside Out. I think it was an amazing original film and one of the best things we've seen in a while from Pixar. But I don't know I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened sooner. But if tomorrow they come out and they announce something amazing there, I'll be excited if it looks right. Though I would hate to lose Figment and the chance of getting Dreamfinder back. Number 2, If You Had Wings. My memories of going to the Magic Kingdom, even in my earliest years, did come after the ticket books ended in the 80s. So the reason I mention this is I know that If You Had Wings was one of those attractions that a lot of people would go to because it did not require the tickets. It was like a free attraction. And you had that also at Disneyland with things like, I believe the Carousel of Progress was that way, and maybe Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. So that right away is going to bring fond memories to a lot of kids. But even though we went after that, it still served a similar purpose, because you might wait in line once for Space Mountain or something else, or even the Starjets at the time. But this you could go on a lot of times. And I know it sounds like, well, that means it was less popular or less attractive for guests. But I don't know if that's really true, because these Omnimover attractions, I mean, you have a lot of these that can run 2,000 to 3,000 people through in an hour. And that's the case with the Epcot Center attractions too. And that can really be deceptive in terms of popularity, because you compare that to something that maybe has like Frozen Ever After, which might have, you can do 800 people or, depending on the day. You work that out and you think that's a lot of people in line that would not be in line with something had a much higher capacity. If You Had Wings was not the most popular attraction in the park, but a lot of kids rode it over and over like me. And this is another Omnimover. I think you're sensing a pattern here, where Claude Coates, one of Disney's great minds, found such an inventive way to put things into what's really a pretty cramped space. It's if you never rode If You Had Wings and aren't aware, it's what's currently in the spot where Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger spin is. Though If You Had Wings was the original inhabitant way back in 1972. And of course, when they lost the sponsorship, the sponsor was Eastern Airlines. Then it became If You Could Fly. And then it went to Delta came in. It was Delta Dream Flight, which also was a fun attraction. And then when that dropped, then they had Take Flight. So to give you kind of a background, If You Had Wings was the original one. And what's interesting to me is that it closed in the 80s. So my memories of it that I'm so into are really from a fairly small number of trips, like 3 or 4 trips that we took before it closed, if that, and maybe even a few. I'm thinking of its inferior version that came right after it with a different song, because it really was kind of an advertisement for Eastern Airlines. But it was so much fun. I mean, it's amazing what you can do with someone who really knows how to space things together. Coach used rear projectors, like 16 millimeter projectors done on small screens. He mixed them in with sets. So it made you feel like, hey, I'm going to Mexico or Jamaica or the Bahamas. And it was just fun. And again, it ended with a speed room. If you could dial up the things that would be my favorite attraction, just put a speed room at the end, and the odds are it's pretty good. And you do still see the speed room. If you're wondering where that is, it's in Buzz Lightyear. That room where you come in and you're actually shooting the screen. It's not a great spot for points. It comes near the end of the attraction. Because they are using the same track. So in that case, that was another one of the situations where you were enveloped by some sort of movement. There was a bunch of different transportation, especially flying, given the theme of the attraction. Another thing it did much better than Buzz Lightyear, if You Had Wings did, is it interacted well with the People Mover. Right now, you have kind of a strange, obstructed view of Buzz Lightyear. You don't have a very good view of the attraction. At the time, you had a much larger vantage point from the People Mover, and it was cool because it felt like you had a good view up there. You had a good view in the ride of everything. Everything felt like it clicked together in terms of Tomorrowland. And of course, I have to mention the wonderful song, again, Exitensio and Buddy Baker are putting together the If You Had Wings song, which is very repetitive, but also so much fun. And it gets in your head. It's hard to explain. The online videos, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, don't do justice to just how fun and clever it was, and it wasn't super ambitious, and that's okay. It's okay to have these complimentary attractions that you could just jump on. You're in air conditioning for 5 minutes, and you're having a great time, and that's what If You Had Wings was. Number 1, Horizons. This is probably not a shock to anyone who's been reading my site or has read what I have to say on Twitter, followed this podcast at all. And also, just being a Disney fan of Epcot from the 80s, I know it's a cliche for Horizons to be your favorite attraction. I didn't realize how much of a cliche it was until I started interacting more with other Disney fans and realized, yes, there are a lot of people that love this attraction. And there's a good reason. It's a brilliant ride. It's 15 minutes long again, an Omnimover attraction. It summarized so many of the themes that drew me to Epcot Center and continue to draw me there today. Now, this one also opened a bit late. It opened in 1983 in October. I was lucky enough again on that same May 1998 trip to get to ride it when they reopened it, because it actually closed for a while earlier in the 90s. But when we were there, Test Track still hadn't opened yet. It had been being built for 2 years. So they felt like they needed to have something else in the area. So they opened up Horizons again. So at that point, I rode that a lot of times during that trip in May of that year, because you kind of I wasn't planning to go back anytime soon, and actually didn't go back for almost 6 years after that, or 7 years. I'm glad that I was able to ride classics like that, and also the original Living Seas along with that in Journey to Imagination. But Horizon still stood out as the most important thing. I love the unique ride system where you're kind of up against the wall. It's not like the Spaceship Earth type or even ones where the car turns left and right like the Haunted Mansion. This is one where you're basically up against the wall and you're looking out at show scenes, but it allowed them to cram so much into the space. It was a very large building, but there were some late cuts to budget, so they had to find more inventive ways to show what was happening in the attraction. I just love so much. Like, from when you walk in, you've got the optimistic music and shots of the future before you even get inside the ride. And once you jump on, you have the looking back at tomorrow sequence with some of the famous shots there of the robot barber and everything falling apart in the kitchen. And then you come to what might be my favorite part, the Omnisphere itself. I've never considered myself someone who really likes screens that much in attractions, but I feel like during this podcast, I just keep raving about them. But this was basically two giant OmniMax screens that you were able to get an interesting perspective because you were moving side to side, and seeing, a space shuttle launch, basically looking at DNA going underwater. It was something that even today, if they did something similar to this, would wow guests, because you see how the popularity of Soarin'. It's not, you're not off the ground, but in a sense, it has a very similar feeling than that. And of course, there's the wonderful music, New Horizons, the song by George Wilkins. It's just, to me, that song, yes, it's very basic. It has a very simple message, but that's okay. At some point, just that idea, if you can dream it, then you can do it. It's a quote that people often attribute to Walt Disney incorrectly, but I think the theme and idea could totally match what he stood for, particularly in terms of what he wanted to do at Epcot and even in some of his later years with attractions. YouTube videos can only do so much. They can't show you the feeling of being in that attraction. Like even some of the hallways, like some of the transition scenes with the things lit up and music playing, they were wondrous. They were things that give me chills just thinking about them. And then, of course, the final stretch where you go through each of the areas, space, the desert, and water, and then you get to choose your own finale, which I know is a very basic, interactive idea by today's standards, but it was really cool getting to vote and pick where you wanted. My brother and sister and I would always be fighting over which one we wanted. None of us wanted to go to the desert, yet somehow we always ended up there in some weird way. It was such an ambitious ride that did more than just look to the future. It looked at what is possible for all of us. And I think given what, at least in the United States, what we're currently experiencing here, it's important to have that viewpoint and keep thinking that way. And rides like Horizons do more than just provide passing entertainment. To me, they have a message that can cover any part of our life. So now I want to give some love to attractions that nearly made the list. And I could easily make the case for a lot of these that they deserve to be in a top 5. Now, I could have made this easier on myself by doing a top 10. Then it would be a case where something like World of Motion that was 5 could easily be 6, and then I could slide in something else. But I wanted to make it a little harder on myself to really nail down to just 5 attractions. Just in the Magic Kingdom, for example, looking at Tomorrowland, there are so many attractions there that I enjoyed. So right away, the Timekeeper was one of my favorite uses of the 360 Circle Vision technology right off the bat. And all those original Circle Vision films are still very impressive. Another, across the way, you had Mission to Mars, which I did ride as a kid. And I liked just how kind of hokey it was and how you never actually got to Mars and had a problem right at the last minute. But what they did after that with the extraterrestrial alien encounter is fascinating. I would love to go in there and sit in those seats and experience that rather than Stitch's Great Escape. Because what it was is, Michael Eisner made an effort in the 90s to try and make Disney edgier. I hate to use that term, but I think that's what he was looking for. He even went in originally and said it wasn't scary enough, but it still did feel a little out of place in Tomorrowland, where you have mostly an optimistic view of the future and space and everything else. And then you have this alien apparently eating people in your ears through the binaural audio. But it was something really cool, and I wish there was a way to save it. And honestly, given what's there now, would it really be worse to have that in there? I don't think so. I think the Alien Encounter would stand up, and especially because it wasn't tied to an exact IP. Disney was creating new stuff, an actual new story that wasn't just about trying to shoehorn Stitch into an area where he didn't really fit. And I also want to mention Delta Dream Flight. As I mentioned earlier, it is not as good as If You Had Wings. It doesn't have a great song. It does not have the same effective use in terms of its design, but it still had really cool sets. It did interesting things in the 90s and making it feel like you were flying or you were going on a journey. And there are still connections between Delta Dream Flight and a lot of the attractions I love in Epcot Center. And I also want to mention the Skyway, which it makes me sad just to think about the fact that the Skyway is not flying over either Disneyland or Disney World. That sense of movement and a world on the move that could really happen you see it with the People Mover in Tomorrowland at night. Think of the People Mover and then the Skyway in the same place, and also the Astro Orbiter, which was the Star Jets. All of those things working in tandem created this sense of motion that's just not there, especially in California is not there, but isn't there as much in Florida. And finally, in the Magic Kingdom, I want to mention 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which we loved as a kid. It had lines that took forever, similar to how it is with Nemo in California. But we love the idea and could easily be sold the fact that you were going under the sea and in a submarine. So that was a sad one to lose, though I really do understand. Now, going back to Epcot Center, there are a ton more. I just can't believe that I couldn't find a way to fit Cranium Command into this list, because that was one in more in the 90s, a show that I really enjoyed. Wonders of Life in general is a fascinating pavilion. I'd love to dig more into its history and how that was put together, and then it's sad. And what I hear, Cranium Command is still, some of its show materials are still there in the building, which is crazy to me, but also a little sad. I also love the original Living Seas. I feel like it makes me very sad, almost as sad as what's happened with Figment, to see what they've done with the ride. And it's not just because Nemo's in there. If they could find a way to incorporate Nemo, but not close off a lot of the aquarium, it would be great. You know how the scenes are upstairs, like when you're in the post-show area or on Seabase Alpha, where you're walking and you could see all the fish and everything. You rode through that, and it was a very cool effect. It also had a good pre-show film. If you haven't checked that out, I highly suggest looking at it on YouTube. I would also mention Food Rocks and especially Kitchen Cabaret, which is so silly and so odd that it ever existed. But you should definitely, another thing to check out on YouTube for sure. And then I miss original songs from Spaceship Earth, Tomorrow's Child, of course, Listen to the Land, and then the songs from the original Universe of Energy. And I must mention the 2 World Showcase rides that have been replaced by inferior rides, particularly in Mexico with El Rio del Tiempo. I know the Grand Fiesta Tour is fun, but I think the original had so much more grace and connection to the country. And I don't know, if Frozen Ever After, I would not say is inferior in a way to Maelstrom. I just love the goofiness of Maelstrom and just how odd the whole thing is in the way it connected to Norway. I'm not going to oversell the fact that it wasn't dated. I just hate seeing Frozen taking over the Norway Pavilion like it did. So I haven't mentioned anything from the Hollywood Studios or the Animal Kingdom. The Hollywood Studios I did go to in its early days, and we had a lot of fun there. I went in a later time. I was also a guest in the Cheers scene in Superstar Television. I think I was bar patron number 4. That was, of course, when I was a little bit older in that same 1998 trip. We also liked the Monster Sound Show. There was the original walking tour, which involved Bette Midler and the little short film, The Lottery. A lot of cool stuff at early Hollywood Studios, then called the Disney MGM Studios. But none of those really hit the level of some of these other ones. That may be the case down the road, depending on if the Great Movie Ride gets closed. I'm not sure that would crack my top 5, but it might make the top 10 if it closes in the near future. And then the Animal Kingdom is so new that they have replaced a few things here and there, but nothing yet that I would say would fall into that area. And I'm not sure it's going to, because even if they decided we're going to get rid of Dinosaur, and I really like Dinosaur, or even, I know they won't do this, but if they were going to make some dramatic change to Expedition Everest, both of those are really good attractions, especially Everest, but they don't have that same connection to me because I rode them more as an adult and not as a kid. One more thing that I wanted to mention is, just out of curiosity, I did put up a poll on Twitter where I listed the 4 attractions that I had as my top 4: Horizons, If You Had Wings, Journey into Imagination, and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. And I asked people just to name their favorite. And I knew Horizons would likely win, though I thought it would get a good test from Journey into Imagination, and it did. As of right now, there's still some time left in the poll. Horizons has received 57% of the vote, 30% for Journey into Imagination, 9% for Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and 4% for If You Had Wings. And that's based on 67 votes, which is not a huge number, but I suspect that if the further this went along, especially with very hardcore Disney fans, the numbers wouldn't change that much. I think Horizons and Journey to Imagination do stand out. I'm a little surprised that there's not more love for Mr. Toad and If You Had Wings, but both of those go back a little further, especially If You Had Wings. I know Mr. Toad was around well into the 90s. And also, I think because Mr. Toad is still at Disneyland, it may not get the same love as if it was completely gone off the radar. So I hope you enjoyed this top 5 list. It was fun to put together and look back. I watched videos of old attractions and thought more about what I really loved in attractions. It's a fun way to think back to early trips while not disregarding the fact that there's still a lot of great things at the parks right now. And I'd love to get your feedback on this list. If you would like to send me feedback, a great way would be you could tweet about it at TomorrowSOC. You could also email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. You could connect with me on Facebook at Tomorrow Society or Instagram, which is at the same thing. I'm really excited. I have a few guests lined up. D23 is just around the corner, and I will have a show to talk about reactions to that. Given that I'm talking about extinct attractions right now, I think we may be talking about a few more that might be going extinct based on if the news goes the way that I suspect. So I have a few good shows lined up, and I'm just going to keep trying to put out more stuff and bring in interesting guests for you. So if you like what you're hearing, I love iTunes reviews. iTunes ratings and reviews are a great way to spread the word about the podcast. You can also subscribe to this podcast through iTunes so you never miss an episode. And of course, if you want to find out more about what I'm doing, you can also go to tomorrowsociety.com and read some of my latest blog posts. The music for this podcast is performed by the Sophisticated Babies and written by Adam Hookey. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you all again very soon.